Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Generosity Workshop series. My name is Christy Mora. I'm going to go ahead and ask our hosts for today, Jim Sheppard, John Wright, and Jess, Bealer, to go ahead and join me. And I'm here on the team here at Generis, and where every day we are inspired to help leaders like you move the needle in generosity. And in today's workshop, Jim, Jess, and John are going to talk us through a few things that can really limit your generosity and stop you from moving that needle forward. We're calling this workshop Uncovering the Lids of Generosity in the Church, and they will be helping you understand how you can identify and eliminate them. But before we get started, if you've been here for the 5 workshops, you know I'm going to take care of some housekeeping. So yes, this workshop will be recorded, and I will be sharing a copy of the recording as well as any other resources we share, and a follow-up email that will go out tomorrow afternoon. After Jim, John, and Jess, I just realized we had 3 J's on this call. After they wrap up their presentation, we'll move into a Q&A session. So that means throughout the presentation, feel free to drop those questions that you have in the Q&A feature. We will get to those at the end of the presentation. So at any time you have a thought or a question, drop it in there and we'll get to it. And the chat is available to introduce yourself. So go ahead, let us know who you are, where you're joining in from, and that's it for me. I know we have a packed session, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Jim.
Christy, thank you so much. It was what a great introduction. And this is the 5th in our summer workshop series. I loved when you proposed this idea to our team. And as it's kind of played out, it's been a boot camp of sorts to help our church leader friends deal with key issues and developing the culture of giving and generosity in their churches. Even as we know, I mean, the big question on the table for many of you is, now that we kind of see ourselves getting through the summer and into the beginning of the ministry year, and hopefully on the other side of COVID for the most part, even though this Delta thing is popping up a little bit. But the question on the minds of many of you is, how do we get people back onto our campuses and back into our in-person worship services? So this is not intended to supersede those conversations. Hopefully this will help you with those conversations. So the first 4, in the first 4 workshops, I don't know if you attended any or all of them, but our first one was Insanely Practical Ideas to Increase Giving. Phenomenal workshop. Number 2 was one that I was personally interested in a lot because I didn't understand cryptocurrency. And we just had Jeff Hensley from our team, the idea of understanding cryptocurrency. He gave us a great primer on that. If you haven't seen that one and you're wrestling with the cryptocurrency issue, that would be a great one to watch. Julie Bullock and I did Communicating with All Types of Givers. Brad Leeper and John Bennett did the art of activating non-givers in your church. If you didn't get a chance to see any of these sessions, they are available at generis.com/blog. And Christy will put that link for you over there in the chat bar. Now, those are fairly obvious issues out there. The one that is not as obvious is the one we're going to talk about today. These are things that are not as obvious. But they're no less important because they can be lids on developing giving and generosity in your church. And so today, joining me are 2 incredibly experienced people, Jessica Bealer, affectionately known as Jess on our team, and John Wright, both of whom have served on the executive teams of very large churches. So they're speaking to you, not just from their experiences of observing this as consultants, but actually sitting in the seat of a decision maker and having to deal with some of this stuff on a regular basis. They've got years of experience and wisdom to share, and I'm really excited to have them here with me today. Jess and John, thanks for joining me. I'm looking forward to this today. Hey, so let's dive right in. I thought I'd just start this off by just posing a question to the 2 of you, and let's just kick this off by saying, what are some ministry areas that might be affecting a church's generosity that maybe they're not even thinking about as of today?
Yeah, so for me, I always look at your volunteer base because we know that like volunteers are the lifeblood of our church, but also we know that they are the most engaged with our church. Both they give the most, so a lot of times they are the most generous with both their time, energy, and resources, and so those are our givers. And so if your volunteer base is not growing, that's definitely a question you should be asking yourself. Is our volunteer base growing? Because if it's not, then it's going to be difficult for your generosity to grow as a church as well. So that's definitely a question that you can ask yourself. Another question that I would be asking, of course, I'm a little biased because this is my specialty, but does your family ministry have visibility across the church as a whole? I think that's a great question to ask. You know, I have never had anyone ever tell me that they wish their church talked about family ministry less. They always will tell me stories about how they're impacting the next generation and how excited that they are, that they're still relevant to, you know, younger families. And so if your family ministry has visibility, people are endeared to it, they're excited about what's coming up for the next generation, and they are more apt to give and to be generous to a church that is impacting the next generation. So that's another question: does your family ministry have visibility? And when I say visibility, I'm talking stage, signage, greeters, social media. It's not just like, let's put up a couple signs. It's really a complete strategy.
Yeah, I think too, Jim, the idea of leadership development, how are we growing up those young leaders? Do we have a real focused plan on identifying, equipping, and releasing new leaders into our ministry? So that's another one that's maybe one of those hidden barriers to generosity, is just the engagement of people who have a vision or a passion for some new area of ministry, or increasing the effectiveness of a particular area.
Good stuff, guys. Good stuff. Hey, so let's kind of go beneath that a little bit. Let's dive in and let's just really just go straight to this whole issue of lids. You know, as you think about generosity and giving development in the church, what are some of the lids that you see out there? When I say lids, I'm thinking of, you know, factors that inadvertently, and nobody would do this on purpose, inadvertently get in the way of developing generous people in our churches. John, why don't you start off and give us a couple that you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think one of the key issues is there's no champion for generosity within the church leadership. A lot of the generosity ends up being siloed. Staff often will see that as the role of a senior pastor, maybe a stewardship pastor if they have one, but nobody's really championing the idea of a culture of generosity, which can come through any facet of the ministry. Another one that we see often is an unhealthy staff culture. People just don't know, what is my role? How does this matter? Does it matter? And what voice do I have to speak into the impact and the effectiveness of what we're doing as a team?
Yeah, good stuff. Jessica?
Yeah, so kind of going back to, is your volunteer base growing, like the question, let's just dig into that, because if it's not growing, it's probably like a telltale sign that you have unhealthy volunteer culture. You're probably going to hear the word culture, but really it's kind of the basis, the foundational where everything grows. So if it's unhealthy, then your volunteer base is not going to be growing. And so we have to begin to understand that a lot of times people will view volunteerism, like my physical service, as, oh, that's me giving to the church. And that's not the same thing, right? Like the Bible calls us to do both serve and also give. And so I think one of the things that we have to focus on is really like establishing healthy volunteer culture. And it's not just about, establishing like, yes, you need to serve as well as give. There's lots of other things that come into play there, but really understanding that we have to build, if we're going to build our volunteer base, which we know will lead to growth of our church, as well as will be more well-resourced. But in addition to that, we also have to understand that it's not just about that. We also have to develop a healthy culture. And also, I would just say that something else that a lot of times is missing, and we have to kind of focus on, there is so much life change that goes on in our church that we never hear about, whether it's in family ministry or in the other dozen ministries that are in your church. There's so much life change that's happening. And a lot of times those stories are very inspirational. People want to plug in, they want to get more involved. We always want to be called to something significant, right? Like if you're trying to pitch me something and you're like, oh, it's just something small, it's little, it's really insignificant, and I don't have time for anything insignificant. But if it's significant, if there is impact there, I definitely am going to plug in, even if that requires sacrificial behavior on my part. And so I think a lot of times we miss collecting stories, like we miss the narratives. And so if we're really going to focus on growing our church, then we have to tell these stories of life change. And maybe that means that you have an email address, firstbaptiststories@gmail.com, or at your church's, whatever it is that the platform that your church uses. But you need to have some way to collect them. You also need to instill into your staff a culture of, hey, when you hear something that's amazing, something that happened in someone's life, you need to write that story down, contact them, ask them to write the story down and send it to you. We have to get to a place where we are collecting these stories, we're collecting these narratives that sets us up for healthy volunteer culture, it sets us up for healthy staff culture, and it sets us up for generosity in the future.
That's so good, guys. So good. And I hope that as you're listening here, one of the things we said in the last workshop I did, communicating to all types of givers, one of the things I want you to understand, there's no magic bullet in developing all this. There's no one thing that you're going to just say, hey, if I could just do that, giving would increase. I mean, we've done this in hundreds of churches by now. Just helping them to try to figure out these things. And usually it's an assembly of things. And this is one of the factors, what Jessica and John are talking about right here. These are things that are hidden from view that we know from experience, that if you don't pay attention to them, even if you do some of these other things, it's going to get in the way. It's going to put a lid on developing generosity, and you just don't even know it yet. The one that I would throw in one from my side is poor, inadequate, or just no communication at all with givers. I hear this lament from pastors and executive pastors, talking about, hey, well, Jim, we have these new people that come into the life of our church. It's like, they show up and then their giving shows up a year and a half later. And I always ask the question, do you have any idea why that is? And hardly anyone can give an answer. And I said, well, let's just start with this. When anyone other than a church gets a new giver, they fall all over themselves to say thank you. And you should do the same. In fact, I would just submit to you, the church ought to be even better at it than others are, and help them find their place. I mean, a lot of times we use connect cards and say, that's kind of the introduction, but I would just say to you, as good as a connect card is, when somebody gives to your church for the first time, that's a better indication that they're really interested in being a part of you. So communicate with them. Send out quarterly statements, recognize people who make larger than normal, gifts to your church if that happens. This is not showing favoritism. It's not moving outside the bounds of Scripture. It's just good practices of reinforcing donor behavior with the kinds of communications you do with them there. So I would add that one in there as well to what John and Jess have talked about.
Jim, I could speak to that because I've told you this story before, and I'm not going to throw it under the bus. But when my family was transitioning from Charlotte to Atlanta, we were kind of displaced from church. We were still going to church, but we didn't have a church home at that point because my husband and I were working in Atlanta during the weeks and home on the weekends. And so, and there's an awkward time where we were transitioning off staff. And so if you're around, people still treat you as if you're on staff. So what we decided to do is in that meantime, we were going to set aside all of our tithes in just a separate account. And then once we found our church home in Atlanta, we were just going to write one big check to the church that we found. Well, we transitioned, and within just a couple months, we realized this one particular church was what was going to be our church home, and that's not where we're at right now. So I'm not throwing my church under the bus, but we had decided this is the church that we're going to attend. And the very first check that I wrote to this church was a $7,000 check because it was months and months and months of we had set aside our tithes and our offerings. And to this day, I have never been communicated from that church about that gift, not one time. And it wasn't that here's the thing, like I didn't need it. I was going to give it anyways. But I remember thinking, wow, it's been 3 or 4 weeks. And like, I kind of thought that was a big deal, And so, 100%. Yeah. And so what you're saying about, giver communications is so incredibly important.
Here's one thing I can tell you for sure. That would not have happened if John Wright had been the executive pastor of that church. I'm 100% certain of that. Hey, Jess, while you're talking, I want you to dive in here because you're talking about this volunteer culture. Talk to us about how does a church go about creating this contagious volunteer culture that'll grow the volunteer base and get people more engaged, which feeds generosity. Talk to us about that for a few minutes.
Yeah, I was sitting with a veteran in ministry, long time executive pastor at a church in Alabama. This is a couple months ago. And I just said the terminology contagious volunteer culture, create a contagious volunteer culture. And he asked me like, well, what is that? And I began to describe what it was. And he said, I don't think that I've ever been a part of something like that. And it broke my heart, which it tells a lot about his commitment to Christ, right? And his obedience to Christ, that even when he wasn't a part of something that was so contagious and so exciting, he still hung in there. But we have to also understand that our church is filled with people from all walks of life, new people who are just walking in the door for the first time and they're looking for something to plug in and give purpose to their life, and other people who've been around a really long time and are beginning to experience burnout. So we have to understand that a contagious volunteer culture is a culture that appeals to everyone. That's so exciting that you go out and you talk about it with other people. So it catches, right? Contagious means it catches. And so it's catching. And so here, I'm just going to give you a formula. It's a really basic formula. This is kind of how I coach ministry leaders to create it. It's very basic. Clarity plus empowerment plus appreciation equals longevity. Clarity plus empowerment plus appreciation equals longevity. So let's just kind of dig into that formula real quick and kind of define what each of those parts mean. Clarity is, how do I win? If a person doesn't know how to win in the role that they have been given, it's going to very quickly, they're going to get frustrated. They're going to stop showing up. If they feel like they show up and they're not making a difference. So it's really important that we clarify what the win is. How do we do that? We have to give them a job description, roles and responsibility, whatever you want to call it. They have to know what your expectations are and how they're going to win. They also need to understand how their function and their purpose plays into the whole. So that's just as important. Like, they need to understand what it is, that the importance of their role is. I had a church once that they had been non-permanent for a very long time. And the children's ministry volunteers were really like across the campus. I mean, it was a very, very far distance between the auditorium and the children's ministry. And many times they would pull double duty and they would never actually make it into the church service. So they were just over in this children's wing area. And it wasn't long. I mean, literally like a year and a half in, that all of their volunteers were kind of flaking out and rolling off of the rosters. And like, they didn't have a volunteer base anymore. And so when we dug down, we realized that like, they don't understand their purpose. They don't understand how they're playing a part in the bigger church. And so what we did, we had this initiative called Connect the Dots. And the ideal was that we just want them to understand that what they're doing matters and that life change is occurring because of them. And so very, very practical thought here. But what we did was on Monday, we run that decisions report, like any decision that had been made on Monday morning, we ran that report and we cross-referenced it with the children who had checked into children's ministry. And then we contacted those volunteers and said, hey, I just want you to know that because you were serving Emily's family, her mom got saved this week. Like, she met Christ for the first time. Or, Jonathan's parents have been struggling. They just signed up for marital counseling. The reason they were doing that is because you were serving Jonathan. And so we just began to tie those connections together. And so making sure that they understand what it is they're supposed to be doing, but also the purpose impact. So that's what clarity is. Empowerment is just that. It's trust. It's saying, hey, I trust you in this role. Not that you're not going to make mistakes, right? Because that's going to happen. But I trust you enough to put out the fires. You don't have to come run into me every time there's a problem. I trust you to solve those. It's also granting them opportunities to lead. If I was a volunteer on a team and I was entering, I would be pretty bored after a few weeks if people weren't giving me opportunities to lead, because I'm a leader. And so you need to be able to kind of set a track for what's next for you. So not just like, hey, here's your role, you're going to be in this certain area or in this certain role, and that this is your job function. No, here's your role. But then also, if you'd like to, you could kind of own this as well. Or, we want you to be problem solving. So how can we do this better? Those types of things, just empowering your volunteer base to lead and to step up to that next level of leadership. Appreciation is the secret sauce. These are it's really your greatest asset. I mean, I feel like that appreciation is, here's the thing. You can have clarity and empowerment and not have appreciation, and people won't stick around. You could be wishy-washy on clarity. Maybe you don't empower, but you appreciate the daylights out of them. They will still stick around. Like, appreciation is really like the key to this formula. They have to feel like they are known, loved, and that they're recognized for their sacrifices. And also just something to keep in mind, that the benefits to serving in your ministry should outweigh the sacrifices. If the sacrifices outweigh the benefits, even if those benefits are like you can't place a value on them. I'm not talking about a t-shirt or anything. It's purpose, it's impact, it's life change, collaboration, it's camaraderie, teammates, tribe, all those things. But the benefits should outweigh the sacrifices. If they don't, that's when burnout starts to happen. So how do we create a contagious volunteer culture where people will stick around, they'll have longevity, but they'll also invite others alongside? Clarity, empowerment, appreciation. And that's how we do it. I would just say that a healthy volunteer base is the greatest asset that your church has going into this next season, where we're anticipating and hoping for growth.
Jessica, that is so spot on, because I think, as I look at my own church and look at other churches around, it's like the thing that we're having the biggest challenge with is getting our volunteer base back re-engaged. I mean, we spent years and years and years building these teams of people that it takes to pull off our weekend experiences, for example, and getting them back re-engaged. Your comments there are just, I hope that everybody who was here, if you understood what I said, is I know you're dealing with this question, and some of what we're going to help you with today is going to help you to deal with that question. How do you get your people back in the building, back on your campus, back re-engaged in your weekend services? So super stuff. I love that little formula there. Hey, John, so you were executive pastor in a large church, and your whole thing is kind of, in addition to generosity, you deal with staff culture and leadership development and things like that. I think if I were sitting after, kind of your early comments, if I were sitting out there in one of these seats today, my question would be this. John, what practical steps can I take right now? Some things that I can do between now and Thanksgiving to help me begin to grow a healthy staff culture and the leadership of my church as it relates to these lids we're talking about.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Jess, for sharing. Appreciate that. One thing I would say to Jess's comments, and this plays to staff too, if the mission statement of your church is not true for your staff and your volunteers, it's not true for anybody. So if you've got this beautiful mission statement on your website that says, hey, our vision is to, help people know that Jesus is more, or whatever, if your volunteers and your staff don't have that experience, then it's not working. So I would just challenge you to make sure that whatever the mission is of your church, it starts with your staff and then moves to your volunteers. So I'll just leave that out there. But so Jim, to get into your question, I mean, I'm an NFL fan. We're about to go into preseason, and here's what we know: winning teams are made up of winning players. The jerseys that sell the most are the ones of players that win, right? And so that's engagement. They see a winner and they want to engage. They want to be part of what's happening there. If your staff team is effective, it instills confidence in your volunteers and in your church family. So something that's interesting as an executive leader, if you're an executive pastor or senior pastor, you have influence within your congregation, but your team has impact. Right? You're able to preach and you're able to influence from a distance, but the impact that's happening in your church is because you've got amazing people who are in there connecting to volunteers, connecting to congregation, right? That's where the impact actually happens. And so one of the things is to help the individuals on your team to play or engage or contribute at their highest level. So how do we do that? And I would start by saying you have to help them see how it matters. And Jess shared this about volunteers as well. But how do you help your team understand that what they're doing is important and it makes a difference? And I think about Nehemiah. So if as a leader, if you're on this call and you've never read the first 8 chapters of Nehemiah, set some time aside the rest of this week and go do that. But here's the deal with Nehemiah. He had this amazing vision. He didn't even live in Jerusalem. He's a long ways away. He's called in, and he has this vision to rebuild the wall, to hang the doors, and to make a place for people to worship, right? So that's our job, right? But one of the things that's interesting is in Nehemiah chapter 4, it says the laborers were giving out and they were quitting and they were halfway done. And here's the thing, as a leader, Nehemiah is walking around on his horse and he's seeing the vision. God gave him this amazing vision. And as a leader on this call, God's given you an incredible vision. But your team, they're down on their hands and knees making bricks. They're pulling together little piles of dirt. Their hands are sore, their backs are sore, they're sunburned, and they're sitting there thinking, does this even matter? All I do all day long is I make bricks. You're this leader, this visionary guy who's like, man, the city's going to be amazing. They don't get it. And so our job as leaders is to help them understand, guys, look this way and look this way. Do you see what's happening? These little bricks that you're kicking out every single day, right? Sunday's coming, Wednesday's coming. These bricks matter, right? And so you have to help them see, how does this impact the greater vision? Because they don't, right? In Isaiah, it says, behold, I'm doing something new. Now it springs up. Do you not see it? Here's what we know as leaders. Some of us see it, some of us don't, and some never will. And so as a leader, we have to cast that vision over and over, but we have to make it small, bring it down to the impact that that person's making, whether it's a staff member, whether it's a volunteer. How does this brick change the world? That's our job as leaders, okay? So we want to start there, help them see the vision. Number 2, everybody that joins our staff team says they're called, right? We go through the interview process and we're like, why do you want to be part of this church and this team? Man, I feel called to it. I've never felt called to something like this like I do now. Great. Well, so what happens, right? Because right down the road, you're having to challenge them with something, do a professional development conversation, or maybe offboard them, right? So there's a process that everybody goes through on staff, and I'll use all C's just because most of us are in ministry. So this idea that we're called, then all of a sudden we feel constrained. And after that, we move to being complacent, and then we get caught doing something stupid, and ultimately we're caustic. So I'll say those again. You're called, then you're constrained, right? Something happened. Hey, we don't do that here. We run into culture. So we start to feel constrained. As soon as we feel constrained, we start phoning it in. Now we're complacent. We're not bringing our best anymore. And eventually we either get caught doing something stupid or we just get caustic. We stay and we're not a good voice for the vision anymore. So as the leader, we have an opportunity, but also a responsibility to keep our team members in a called place. We keep them there. If we have to have a conversation that we know they're going to feel constrained or it's going to cause them to be complacent, we have to help them understand why this matters and how it actually impacts us and keeps them in a called place, okay? So I want to walk through some really practical steps just quickly on how do we keep them in a called place. Thanks, Jim. Those are there in your little chat bar. So review current job description. Jess talked about this with volunteers. Critical coming out of the season that we've been in to recast a job description. Determine with the staff member what's still relevant and what's not. What's changed? What do you do now that you didn't do before? And maybe are there aspects of the role that should or could be delegated to somebody else or relegated, right? Like we don't even need to do that anymore. Just stop. It's not effective. It's not important. It's not part of what we do. So go through the job description. And then this is something that happens very infrequently is ask a series of questions about them. Which of your strengths are underutilized in your current role? What are your current career priorities and goals that most excite you? How do you think this current job aligns with your talents, gifts, and experiences? What barriers or hurdles exist to achieving your professional and ministerial goals? And what are some learning opportunities that you could participate in? What new or improved skill would be helpful for you to be more effective in your role, right? There's this 3-word phrase we've heard a lot about in the last 18 months called gain of function, right? Jessica talked about culture. Culture is a place where things grow. Horticulture, agriculture, a throat culture, a strep culture, right? It could be positive or negative, but the whole idea is how do we put our staff in a place where we can achieve gain of function? If you're on this call and you're an executive leader, that's your job. You have to create a culture that promotes gain of function for your team. All right. So once your staff is aligned, they've redesigned job descriptions, they're re-engaged in ministry, then the impact and effectiveness of their ministry actually increases. From there, Jess mentioned this too, teach them to be great storytellers and evangelists for their area of ministry and impact. They should be coming to you with the stories and telling you amazing things that happen. And then you in turn communicate that to your congregation, to your other staff, all of that. And when ministry happens and it's well celebrated and well communicated to the church family, it inspires confidence. And everybody goes out and buys the jerseys, right? Because your team is winning. They're confident in what is happening at your church. Impact and confidence inspires generosity, period. So I'll take a breath. Any thoughts or feedback on that? Most welcome.
Yeah, I know that I've already see a couple of questions, one that we got in advance. John, we'll come back to you when we go to Q&A to speak to that a little bit more, but it's obvious that you're speaking into the pain point of some people. They're dealing with this stuff. So that's so good. Hey, Jess, before we go to the Q&A, I'd love for you to come back in and say a few words to us about, you know, just this whole idea of parent engagement. I mean, there's no question COVID has flipped the script on student and children's ministry, but especially as it relates to parent engagement. So if I was sitting there in the seat of a family ministry director or somebody on staff in a church trying to figure that out, how can a church better engage with parents? What are some ideas and some ways that you've seen that really work here in 2021?
Yeah, so personal is better. Like, I think that I would have said that was true even 5-10 years ago, but it's more true now after COVID because there was such a disconnect. I mean, the churches that saw success with staying engaged, staying connected were the ones who were making personal calls or sending text or dropping things off on the porch. And so parents kind of got used to that personal connection. If your church was one of those who didn't do well with that, now is an opportunity to step up to the plate because it's still what they're looking for. They're looking for personal connection. I think the flash of ministry, specifically in children's ministry and student ministry, while you can't be irrelevant, you don't want to look ancient or vintage. At the same time, the flash is not nearly as important as the personal aspect is. I remember we were doing a generis call and Carrie Newhoff was on the call and he said, no one should outlocal the local church. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, yes. Like, and it was such a simple statement, but essentially like no one should minister to connect with better than your body, than your staff, than your volunteers, your lay leadership. Like you should be the local church. And so personal is better, even when it comes to engaging with parents. Emails are out and texting with video messaging is in. Do you know, I read something somewhere, you know, people say that all the time. I did genuinely read it. I don't know where I read it from, but I absolutely believe it, that within 3 weeks of COVID hitting in last March, so as of April, there was a 700% increase in emails that people were receiving because the marketplace moved entirely online. And so the only form of communication that they had were all these email addresses. So we were all getting bombarded with marketing emails. And the same thing was true for the church. We were just like, oh my gosh, we got to keep you up to date with what's going on with online and how you stay connected and how we're going to do small groups and, you know, all this, you know, how you give now, like all the emails just went and people just tuned out. They like got tired of reading emails. But they will still pick up their phone when it buzzes and with the text notification. So texting is in. I would even go so far as to say that, you know, lots of content words in text, I would move away from that and I would just do video messaging. There's so many studies out there that if you have a link or a video, especially if it's a link to a video or you can see, you know, the picture of the video, that people are far more likely to click on that. So a 1-minute update, maybe from your student pastor, your preschool pastor, your children's pastor, whatever, just a 1-minute update, maybe a drive time conversation starter, just something super practical, will do better in connection than an email ever will. So emails are out, texting is in. Along those same lines of just being personal, it's all about relationships. One of the best ways to engage parents is to engage their children. I'm always going to tune in. If you're ministering to my kids, I'm going to be super tuned into that and very appreciative. Micah went through a really rough season. I have a 2020 graduate. So he was a high school graduate in 2020. It was a really, really rough season. And his small group leader, Joey was his name, was so invested into Micah and making sure that he was healthy and that he was doing okay and that he was finding moments of joy even in a really disastrous season. And I was so grateful to that I tuned into everything that Joey sent out, because Joey was making an impact on my kids' lives. And so I would just say relationships. Like the focus of this next season is building small group relationships, mentor relationships, Christ-centered friendships, because kids were struggling with anxiety and depression. How do we overcome that? Every therapist, psychologist out there would tell you that healthy friendships is one of the greatest assets that you can have to overcoming anxiety and depression. And so create a ministry that builds healthy friendships, but it's all about relationships for kids, which means it's all about relationships for parents, because as parents, we will do whatever it takes to make sure that our children are growing and thriving and moving forward and healthy. And so focus on relationships. Also focus on mental health. I mentioned anxiety and depression. I mean, it is like the biggest buzzword right now. I mean, every time you turn on the TV, it's Simone Biles and like how she's a hero, right? Because she identified this thing that was a big thing that all athletes deal with. And so coming out of COVID, there are so many. I was talking to Chinwe Williams, who is an expert in this field, and she said that with the numbers that she is seeing, she's anticipating that 60 to 70% of students right now are struggling with anxiety in some form or fashion. 60 to 70%. That's 6 or 7 out of 10. I mean, that's more than half are struggling at some point. Maybe it's mild, maybe it's severe, but if you really want to engage with parents, then you've got to address the mental health issue in kids and students. I would also say to create family experiences. I did a massive study. This was pre-COVID. It was a study on millennials and what was attractive to them, things that appealed to them, necessities, what they saw as essential and non-essential. And one of the things that they expressed was that they loved shared experiences with their child. Well, most of the kids in our children's ministry and students, because I'm the first year of a millennial and I have 4 teenagers now. And so most of millennials are saying that they want shared experiences with their child. Now, for a really long time, the church model for student ministry and children's ministry was we come to church together, we separate, and then at the end, we come back together and we leave. And I don't really see anything that you did. You don't see what I did. We don't share anything. So creating like a shared experience is really important. That could be a family experience where there's programming, or it could be something as simple. My church, local church in Cumming, Georgia, actually laid turf in the front and the back. They put in these really great basketball goals, like really nice ones, like in the ground. They put cornhole and ring toss and soccer goals and everything on this massive turf. And they just invited families to come in early, stay late, hang around between the services. And those turf areas are filled with hundreds of people every single week. They're coming together, they're having a great shared. It could be a simple solution like that, but definitely create family experiences that are shared between the kids and their parents. And then the last thing I would just say is solve the problems that are plaguing parents. If you can give me a solution that's going to help me right now, I'm definitely going to tune in to what's going on in your ministry. A lot of students across the nation are behind right now in school. A lot of kids who were ahead are now behind. They were in advanced classes and now they're struggling because we all know that what we had to deal with over the last year with online learning wasn't as efficient as going to school every single day and sitting and interacting with a teacher. I'm sure there are some students out there that thrived in that, but most of them did not. And so there are a lot of kids who are behind right now. And tutoring is so very expensive, hundreds of dollars an hour for a really great tutor. If you can do tutoring at your church and you can solve that problem for parents, do that. There's so much great need for counseling right now, not just with mental health, but with marital counseling. If you can kind of focus in on like meeting their needs with counseling, that's another great thing. Date nights is another. I would have said don't do date nights 2 or 3 years ago. The difference now is that we are post-COVID and marriages are suffering. They are struggling. They can't afford to hire a sitter and go to the movies and go out to eat. But you could serve families in a very practical way by creating date nights and then inviting them to engage in other things where they can share experiences with their kids. So I would say even date nights is something. And then finally, intentional resourcing. And I would just say intentional resourcing is not a handout on Sunday morning. Those are never used. Literally, statistics show us that 2% of those ever make it to the refrigerator. And of those, only about 10 to 20% are actually utilized. So handouts on Sunday morning, for the most part, do not work. But intentional resources, when I'm saying that, is identifying what the issues are in their lives and resourcing them in that way. Other thing that I would say about intentional resourcing to keep families engaged is to look at the rhythm of their lives and play your resourcing to that rhythm. So for example, if, we're going back to school right now. And so maybe lunchbox notes, maybe that's something that you create and you hand out to parents and you're like, hey, we want to help you to communicate better with your kids. We want to help you grow your child's faith at your house. All you have to do is take this piece of paper that we just gave you and cut it up and put a lunchbox note in their lunchbox, and they're going, and there you go. Help them to grow their child's faith in a very, very practical way that plays into the rhythm of their life. Better yet, don't give them a handout on Sunday morning. Text them a link that they can print at home. That would work even better. But yeah, intentional resourcing is additional way. So be personal, don't email, focus on relationships, don't ignore mental health issues, create shared experiences, and then intentionally resource and solve the problems that parents are facing right now. That's a quick 5-minute plan to how to keep parents engaged and how to better engage them in this next season.
You guys just put a ton of value on the table for people who are watching this. I hope they were paying attention. The good news is you probably couldn't take notes fast enough, and you've got the replay at your disposal. So go back and grab that, because John and Jessica just unpacked an incredible amount of stuff for you guys out there. So thank you for that. Let's do this. Enough from us. Let's listen to our people who are out there. I see a couple in the Q&A bar, but we had a couple of questions that actually came in with registration. John, I'd like to ask you to take on the first one. This is right down your alley. Question is, church is 60 plus years old, has a number of longtime families. With that comes a tendency to quote unquote, do what we've always done and quote, rely on people we've always relied on. I think we're creating a lid at the leadership level without even realizing it and getting frustrated because the lid won't come off. How can I lead up in this situation? A great question, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a few different ways I would answer this, and probably all of them will agitate you, which is awesome. That's I love doing that. So I think number one, just add water, right? So if you've got a stream that's blocked up with a big old rock, you can try to use all your energy to try to leverage that rock out of the stream and move it, or you can go further upstream and add more water. And eventually it's like, where's that rock that used to be in the middle of the stream? Oh, it's underneath the water. So what I would say to answer your question is, you don't have to necessarily change all the things you've always done. Just start doing some new things. And what I would say is new things require new people and new vision. So reach out to people who are effective in their world outside of church. We had something when I was leading up in Minnesota at a large church. We did something called the Foundry. And I reached out to staff and said, hey, who are the people in your ministry who are under 40, who are absolutely crushing it in their vocational world? And we reached out to them and brought them together for something that was a quarterly thing. It was a 2-year commitment. It was one Saturday every quarter. And the idea was blow stuff up. What are we doing at our church right now that based on your worldview, your perspective, we could do significantly better? We could do it faster. We could do it more effectively. What might that look like? And we just started having vision sessions with these young leaders who, guess what, guys? They didn't want to work in kids ministry. They didn't want to work in the nursery. They didn't want to work in the parking lot. They didn't want to be an usher, but they were brilliant people and in their own area. And we were not accessing their brilliance because we were trying to slot them into things that we needed them to do. That's the old stuff. What's God put on their heart to do? What is the thing that they want to bring, right? When Carrie Newhoff says that no one should outlocal the local church, that's exactly what happened. We brought these young leaders in and said, what would you do if you could do anything to bring the gospel to the people in your world? What would that look like? And we gave them the keys and we let them start blowing stuff up. And so that's one thing I would say is if it's an older congregation that hasn't done a lot of things new, don't try to eliminate what's there. Add to it, bring some new vision, bring some new passion, and don't put those young leaders in a box. Let them, you want to, the parameters around it have to still fit your mission and vision as a church, but it might be a completely different thing from a ministry perspective of what they're, the stuff that Jess was talking about with mental health and things like that, family issues, all those kinds of things. Those young leaders have the knowledge and expertise to create new ministries in those areas. And so I would say you lead up by leaning in. Who are those young leaders that you could bring to the table and start letting them poke around the edges a little bit and eventually let them just blow stuff up, and don't change what you've done. And just anecdotally, I was part of a church that had a traditional service, robed choir, the bell choir, the organ, all of those things. And there were only a couple hundred people in there. And we were a church of 6,000. And it was like, man, we should just kill that thing. And so as we talked and prayed about it, we actually decided, let's create a room for them, because they were in a 4,500 seat auditorium with 200 people. And it was horrific. It was a terrible experience. So we're thinking nobody wants this. We created a separate space for them, a new environment, venue for them. And when we launched that thing, we packed out 2 services in a 500 seat auditorium. So we went from 200 people to 1,000. And then we started live streaming that into local nursing homes, because there were people who wanted that traditional experience, not the people who were necessarily attending. But we could have killed something because it seemed old and outdated, and it turned into something that was super effective in reaching people with the gospel in our community. But we had to think differently about it. So just because it's old doesn't mean it's bad. Just because it's new doesn't mean it's good, and vice versa. So bring people to the table that can bring new vision and fresh eyes to the things that you're doing, because it's likely those folks are not necessarily on your staff team. But they are on your volunteer team, and they're sitting in your auditoriums on the weekend, and they have passion for ministry. You just got to let them run.
Super. That's so good, John. So good. That feels like the voice of somebody who's actually had to deal with that at some point in time. Hey, so Jessica, you mentioned in your comments this idea of the benefits outweighing the sacrifices. And so we've got a question here. So how would you communicate the benefits outweighing the sacrifices in a broad way, like from the platform or signage or whatever you're going to do there?
Yeah, so I would probably first start by making sure that the benefits do outweigh the sacrifices. It's really hard to communicate something that doesn't happen. I'm not saying that it isn't that way at your church. But when I say benefits, there should be this like intrinsic value, of course, and you should connect the dots to life change and all that. But there should also be some physical benefits too. If you can solve problems for your volunteers, they're much more likely to sign up. So for example, if they're going to be there for 2 services, what are you going to do with their kids? If they have kids or students, are they just going to be like trapped in the church building for 4 hours? That's a problem that needs to be solved. Something else that you need to be thinking about is the food issue. A lot of times we put a basket out with some granola bars and some Pop-Tarts, and we think, oh, that's enough. But if they're going to be there from 8 a.m. until 1 p.m. because they're serving and attending, you need to feed them. And so I think that it starts by answering the question, do the benefits actually truly outweigh the sacrifices? Just start there. Excuse me. And then I think that you have to tell narratives from the stage. This kind of goes back to collecting stories. When we were coming right back after COVID, because I'm in Georgia, so we came back really quick, no one was ready to volunteer. I mean, we were in July of 2020. No one was ready to volunteer. All the staff were like holding the doors open. It did get a little better, but we still found ourselves last fall in this massive deficit. And even though our doors have been open for, several months at that point, but we found ourselves in this massive deficit, and we stood on stage, and I do the talking points at my church. And so we didn't go up and we didn't beg people to serve. We didn't tell them about this, like we didn't guilt trip them. We can't accept kids because we don't have volunteers. Like we didn't do that. Instead, I told a story about how my son, this is a true story, I'm not going to go into all the details, but my son was in a terrible car accident a couple of years ago. And it was the kind of car accident where your car flips and it's upside down in a river. He went off the side of a bridge and it was upside down in the river. Stuff that you see on TV, like water rushing in. He had to break a window and like swim to the riverbank. It was incredibly scary. He was completely fine. Walked away with a scratch where he broke the window. But my daughter came up on the scene with my husband when my husband responded. And my daughter was the one who struggled with it afterwards because death became real to her. So we suffered with separation anxiety from 10 to 11 years old, like wouldn't get out of the car at school, wouldn't go to church classes. And she's super independent, very vocal, extroverted. Like this was completely like unexpected behavior from her. And I got on stage and I told the story of how we went from her literally crying at the doors of school or at the doors of her classroom in the church to getting on a bus that next summer and going to student camp because she was going into middle school. Like, how did we get there? We got there because of volunteers. And then I showed pictures of several people, like with their arms around my child and like, helping them, playing with her at camp, talking to them, just building this narrative, this story where you're sitting there and you're thinking, I want to make a difference like that. Like, it's not just like volunteering matters. No, tell the stories, the true stories of life change that have happened, the ways that volunteers have made impact from the stage, from social media. Like brag on a volunteer on social media and say, hey, get to know this person. She's incredible. This is how she serves. And this is the families that she serves. I would also encourage you to always have a photographer on call all the time. In your ministries, taking pictures of volunteers interacting with attendees so that you can then brag on them, so you can show them, so you always have something to go back to. One of the things that we do a lot of times in a giving moment is I will encourage churches to just get up and say, hey, I just want you to know that if you give here at our church, that you are giving to the next generation. And then we show videos or snippets or pictures or whatever of volunteers engaging with attendees. And we just say, thank you for giving here. Thank you for your generosity. You're investing into the next generation. And inevitably, a couple people will go and sign up afterwards. And so you're thanking them for giving, but you're showing them what it means to be a volunteer, to play a more significant role in the church. And so make sure that you always have a photographer on call. Again, catching those people actually in action. It's just another form of a narrative. I think I would just say that your approach to this has to be to pull the curtain back. There's this curtain right now. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Like, it's what everybody sees. And then there's all the stuff like this that goes on behind the scene that maybe nobody ever sees. We have to pull the curtain back and say, hey, this happens. You have this opportunity to sit here because all these people, are serving, and they're engaged, and they're loving it, and they're part of a team, and it is healthy and thriving. And so we have to constantly find ways to pull that curtain back. Maybe it's acknowledging someone, a volunteer, on a systematic basis from the stage. When I say systematic, that's because I've had this conversation with so many worship pastors where I'm like, hey, let's systematically put a volunteer on stage like every month, and we just thank them for their service. And they're like, awesome. And they do it one time, and then the next time I talk to them 7 months later, we've not done it again. So just go ahead and systematically put it on your calendar. We're going to recognize a volunteer from stage, once a month, or maybe it's a video that you do, however you want to do it. But again, increasing visibility, pulling that curtain back, and first of all, of course, making sure that you have an experience where the benefits truly do outweigh the sacrifices. That's kind of a starting point there. So there's a few ideas for you that hopefully will help you.
Great stuff, Jessica. Great stuff. Really, really good. Hey, John, so we got two more questions here we're going to go to. We've got one that came in as well. Another one I think is right down your alley. Pastor says, I don't believe we have a clear enough vision to create unity for staff as well as synergy for the church. I believe this creates a sense of being stuck we can't have a strong year end or next year if we can't get people to where we're going. If you were sitting on the executive staff in that room, what would you recommend that they do?
Yeah, without a vision, the people perish, right? So I think people won't just come because they're supposed to. I mean, obviously the attendance, and engagement trends in church are not pointed in the direction we'd like to see it. And I think that has a lot to do with vision and a lot to do with engagement. Are people able to engage and bring their pieces and parts to it? So I think if you're a church right now and your leadership team doesn't have a specific vision, and I would challenge you to figure that out. And that might be, using some tools from Barna. Who is in our community? What's true, right? With Sesame Street, who are the people in your neighborhood? What do they need? What's going on in their world right now? And what would it look like for the church to start meeting, those needs for folks and those perceived realities that they're living in? And so I think get some people, and again, this might be an opportunity to get outside of your executive team, your staff team, and bring some different voices to that table and say, what are you seeing? What would you want to be true? There's an exercise of creating personas, maybe 3 or 4 different people groups. You've got the couple with kids, you've got the singles, you've got the empty nesters. What is it that they need from your church right now? And start throwing that stuff up on a whiteboard and figure out who do we need to reach, and how do we need to reach them? And so if you don't have clear vision right now, I agree with you. You're not going to get people to join something that doesn't know where it's going. So I think that's a huge exercise for your church to do. And then once you've got that vision, you've got to build culture, because I've had conversations with people, and you'd almost call them arguments that, vision trumps culture. Here's my statement for all you pastors: just ask Moses. God said, look, go walk that way for 2 weeks and you will inherit the land that I promised you for generations. And 40 years later, God had to literally kill an entire generation of people because the culture was so toxic, they could not move into the vision, even though the vision was very clear and very simple. So whatever your vision is, don't stop at vision, move into culture, and love to help you, in that, and have a conversation with you. If that would be beneficial. But yeah, set aside some focused prayer time, get a team of people with some fresh voices and fresh eyes, and really dial in a healthy vision and a strong, compelling vision for where you want to go in your community, and don't move away from your thread. If you've always been a exegetical, expository, kind of preaching, don't move away from who you are. The church is a body. I mean, Paul talked about it as a body. The body will reject something that is foreign to it. And so you can try to do a lot of new initiatives, but if it doesn't fit the thread of who you've always been, it won't work. So it doesn't mean you don't try anything new, but do new things that still have that thread of consistency of who you've always been.
So spot on, John. I love that. I love those answers, and those are very practical, hands-on things that, spoken from somebody who sat in the executive pastor's seat. You've dealt with that issue before, because you and I were actually together in the trenches up there a little bit, and you were helping to deal with that issue when you were on staff. So good stuff there, really good stuff. I put in the chat bar here just to make it easy for you. Go to our website, but the persons who submitted those questions that John took, if you wanted to talk to John more about either one of those questions, feel free to reach out directly to him. And the person who submitted the question to Jessica, or any of you, just feel free to reach out directly to them. They'll be glad to talk with you. And then if you need more help down the road, something that just goes beyond a 15 to 30-minute conversation, they'll explain to you how you can do that as well. And almost anybody on our team that can help you out. There's one more question that's out there, and I'm going to dive in on this one. People have a soft heart, but so many simply believe they don't have extra and won't put giving above their families, even if the vision is powerful. How do we move people into a mindset of generosity and help them literally increase their actual bottom line so they can give? Boy, I could spend a couple of hours on that question, but I'm going to take just a few minutes and give you some highlights. One, I would say this: most people have more margin than they realized. And what it means is they're living out of a sense of priorities that they've either directly chosen or inadvertently chosen. And most of the choices that I see people, even good Christian people making, have flipped the script on the biblical way of dealing with money. Rather than giving, saving, and living, what they're doing is doing the exact opposite. Their money allocation is living and then saving and then giving, which is why they don't either save enough and or give enough. So I think step number one is make sure that your people are very clear on the biblical pattern for dealing with money. And it is giving, saving, and living. It's why I love Good Sense Financial Ministries and Dave Ramsey's Financial Peace. When they help you to put together a budget, the first line item in your budget is your giving. The second line item is your savings. The third line item is everything else in lifestyle. So that's number one. Second, my experience is even for people who do have margin and who might appear like they don't want to give more, they're probably giving more somewhere else. And so the way that I say it is they don't necessarily have a giving problem. They have a giving to your church problem. I think Jessica really spoke to that earlier when she talked about this idea of all these life change stories that are out in your church, and only a few people know about them, and most of those people are on your staff. Stories of impact drive giving, even from people who don't have significant means. For people who are trying to allocate their money to giving, they're going to give it where they see the greatest impact. That's why disaster relief efforts are that's like low-hanging fruit, because you see that when a hurricane hits Louisiana, or a tornado hits in Kansas, or a flood hits up in New Jersey, whatever happens, people see that when I give $25, $50, $100 to Samaritan's Purse or whomever, I see the impact of that. But they don't see it at your church. And if they don't, then what that means is their giving is going to go somewhere else. So I think motivation, and I think it really speaks to some of the stuff that John's talked about, is developing this really sharp, compelling vision for where you're going directionally. That's a part of the impact. Vision drives impact. In fact, the evidence of an effectively implemented vision is that you are having impact. And so they reinforce one another. Make sure you're doing that. And then, I would say the last thing is make sure that on a regular basis, and the most regular place you can do it is in the offering moment. You don't have to teach a sermon series. In the offering moment, teach your people what the Bible says about money. Teach your people. Make it a discipleship moment for them, and grow them in those things, and grow them on a regular basis. You don't have to preach the series. I would say do a series every now and then, but make sure that every week, at least in the offering moment, that you're speaking to that. And I think what you'll find is there's more margin than people believe. If you just still feel like you don't have, there's people that you're not reaching, there are some folks that legitimately don't have margin, and they need to go through a financial self-help class. Compass is one that I love. Howard Dayton wrote that. Crown, it's the former Crown is still out there. It's a really good resource. Good Sense Financial Ministry out of Willow Creek is excellent, and Financial Peace University from Dave Ramsey. All of those are excellent. Make sure your people, even after they come under spiritual conviction, they have the practical tools to win. And that's what those are. They give you practical tools to win at the personal level. And I think you'll find some success there. So thank you for that question. Well, Jessica, John, thank you so much for being here today. What a great session. I think this really just adds a whole different perspective to our boot camp summer series, and gives us a really solid fifth one here in the library. We're going to wrap this up in a couple of weeks with our final one, which is kind of a year in generosity roundtable, which is going to be our segue to the year-end giving emphasis. And our kind of theme for this year is make this your best year-end ever, even as you're dealing with COVID and all the other things you're trying to get people back in the building and back on your campus. We want you to think in terms of making this your best year-end ever. And some of the things that you heard today would be things that you could put into place in the next few weeks, next few months. It would help you to do that. So Jess, John, thanks again so much. Christy, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you sign us off and tell us all the other things we need to know.
Well, Jim, you actually captured all of it. Thank you, all of you, Jim as well, for this workshop. It was so good, super helpful. I have already shared in the chat the different ways that you connect with Janaris, with Jim, with Jess, with John. Jim already set up our next workshop, State of Generosity Roundtable, looking ahead at a strong year end. We are all hands on deck for year end giving and building a bunch of resources. So join the workshop and keep an eye out because we'll be sending a resource very soon. But before I sign off, I do want to give Jess Bealer a quick moment to share about a workshop, a collective workshop that she has going on right now. So Jess, you could talk about it better than I could.
Yeah, so it kicks off in 2 weeks. It's called The Great Comeback. It's going to be super easy. The format is just 1 hour once a month. So there's 1 hour in August, 1 hour in September, and 1 hour in October. The first session, we're going to be talking about re-engaging your volunteer base. We're actually going to put a plan in place to do that, a very practical plan and accountability for your staff and lay leadership. Then the next one is we're going to be talking about planning for the next 6 months. What does that look like? Hopefully post-COVID, right? Hopefully we get this Delta variant under control. But right, yeah, Jim's crossing his fingers. But yeah, so we're going to be talking about planning for the next 6 months. And then the last one is just making your ministry more attractive. Some of the things that we talked about today, we're just going to expound on those. And we're just going to talk about how can we create an environment, an atmosphere, a culture that is so contagious that people can't walk away without getting engaged. So those are kind of the 3 things. Super simple. If you don't want to do it, maybe you want to, maybe you don't have the time, but you want to assign one of your, staff members to do it. We'd love to have them too.
Thank you for that. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.